In this Baldur's Gate 3 video, we're going to be taking a look at the Warlock, Sorcerer, and Wizard classes and kind of comparing them and seeing why you might choose one of these classes over the other. This is the second video in our series where we sort of take a group of classes that have similar playstyles, in this case, the Mage playstyle or Mage archetype that you might have played in other RPGs, and sort of break down what they have in common, what they have different, to help you further decide what you want to play. I know there are a lot of players out there that want to play a Mage in this game, and they're not quite sure, should I play Sorcerer? Should I play Wizard? Should I play Warlock? What's the difference between these? We're going to go through these things in this video. Again, this is not a full class guide for any of these three classes. It's just information to further give you an understanding, have the basics of these classes, so you can decide what you want to play. So when you first look at these three classes during character creation, before you've even done anything with them, you're going to notice immediately that Warlocks have more health than Sorcerers or Wizards. They have light armor proficiency, which Sorcerers and Wizards don't have any, and they also have proficiency with simple weapons, while Sorcerer and Wizard have proficiency in the same three weapons, which is a lot more limited than the simple weapons that Warlocks have. So what you can extrapolate just from that information right there is that Warlocks are a little bit tankier due to their health and armor proficiency. This isn't always true, but just generally. And they have a little bit more proficiency with weapons, which means they lean slightly more towards the martial side of things than Wizard or Sorcerer. And then looking over the saving throw proficiencies, Sorcerers have proficiency in Charisma and Constitution, Warlocks have it in Wisdom and Charisma, and Wizards have it in Intelligence and Wisdom. What's particularly interesting about the Sorcerer and their Constitution proficiency saving throw is that a lot of spells in this game have concentration, which means that you have to maintain your concentration on this spell in order to keep it up. And when you take damage, you make a Constitution check to see if you maintain your concentration or you got interrupted. And by having proficiency in Constitution, Sorcerers are a lot more likely to maintain their concentration. So if there are spells that you like that have concentration in them, Sorcerer is going to be the better of the three options to use those spells. Constitution is arguably the best saving throw proficiency in the game, so Sorcerers have a little bit of an advantage there. But Wisdom is also an excellent saving throw proficiency, so Warlocks and Wizards also have a very good one in that. Intelligence and Charisma you don't use nearly as often. And then looking at the skills of these three classes, each of these classes gets to pick 2 skills, so that's like not different really. But what's different about these skills is Sorcerer is heavily skewed towards dialogue. They have the option to choose from Persuasion, Intimidation, or Deception, so kind of like the 3 prongs there of dialogue. Warlocks, on the other hand, don't have the option to choose Persuasion, but they can choose from Deception or Intimidation, and Wizards have no dialogue options. So if you want to be someone who's schmoozing people with Persuasion, Sorcerer is a good choice here. Warlock, if you don't mind using Deception or Intimidation to get what you want done in dialogue, is not a bad option. But Wizard is not a very good choice if you are a character that wants to engage in dialogue successfully very often. And some of this decision will probably come down to the way you plan on doing your playthrough and the companions that you bring with you, right? If you want to persuade people into seeing things your way, you might be leaning more towards a good playthrough. But if you don't mind intimidating people into doing what you want, it might not necessarily be a good playthrough. It might be a good playthrough with, any means necessary to accomplish your objective, but your companions might not view that favorably if you're bullying people into do things and you're bringing like friendly companions along or ones that don't agree with intimidation. So keep those things in mind when you're planning your class. Okay, so those things being said, let's jump into the Warlock first and see what separates the Warlock from the Sorcerer and the Wizard. So the first thing to know about the Warlock is the Warlock has gained its spellcasting power from making a pact with a powerful being, and the type of being that is something you will choose during character creation, which is effectively the subclasses of Warlock. So you've made this pact with this being, and therefore you've been granted the power to cast some spells. And the spellcasting ability for Warlocks is Charisma. That means they need high Charisma in order to connect with their spells, and this dovetails very nicely with dialogue, which we talked a little bit about a second ago. So Warlocks are very good in dialogue conversations because they have high Charisma to cast their spells. There's a natural synergy there. But this is where things start to differ from the other spellcasting classes, and you're going to decide during character creation what subclass you want, and you're going to gain class features depending on the pact that you make. The type of being you made a pact with is going to determine some of the class features that you get, but more importantly, it's going to determine some of the spells that you gain as you level up that are not typically found on the Warlock spell list. And just to give you a rough idea without going into this too heavily or we'd be here all day, the Archfey and the Great Old One give you spells that are kind of control and manipulation based, while the Fiend gives you a lot of fire spells. So if you want to deal more damage, the Fiend might be the way to go, but if you want to be more manipulative and conniving and control things a bit more, you might want to go the Great Old One or Archfey. And if you really want, you can use the wiki to see what these spells are ahead of time. Otherwise, you can just go in blind, not knowing what they're going to be, but just having a general idea of the types of spells you're going to gain from what I just said. And one of the biggest differences of Warlocks compared to Sorcerers and Wizards is that they have far fewer spell slots than Sorcerers and Wizards. And when I say far fewer, I mean a lot fewer. And to give you some idea what I mean, at level 5, which is the current cap of early access, Warlocks have 2 spell slots. That means they can cast 2 spells before they need to rest to gain more spell slots. Wizards and Sorcerers have 9. That means they can cast 9 spells before they need to rest in order to gain their spell slots back. The biggest differences are that Warlock will always cast its spells at the highest possible level of spells known for the Warlock. So this means at level 5, they now know level 3 spells. So let's say they're the Fiend and they picked up Burning Hands. Burning Hands is a level 1 spell, but it can be cast at level 2 and level 3 on the Wizard and Sorcerer, but the Warlock will always cast it at level 3. And another key difference here is that Warlocks will regain their spell slots when they short rest. And since you can short rest twice in Baldur's Gate 3 before you need to long rest to regain your short rest charges, you can actually cast 6 spells with a Warlock before you need to long rest compared to the 9 of Sorcerer and Wizard at level 5. When you look at it that way, they're not as far behind as it would initially seem, particularly since they'll cast all of those spells at level 5 as level 3 spells, which is actually more than Wizard and Sorcerer get because they can only cast 2 level 3 spells at that level before they need to rest. However, this does come with a negative that when you're in a combat scenario, you only have 2 spells. When you run out of those 2 spells, you're going to have to short rest, and you can't short rest mid-combat. And this is where Sorcerer and Wizard come, into play and or pull ahead a little bit in this regard, is that they have potentially, if they just rested, 9 spells available to them in one combat, whereas you only have 2 if you're playing a Warlock. And another main feature of the Warlock is Eldritch Blast. Eldritch Blast is a cantrip, which is basically, again, a level 0 spell that you can cast as many times as you want. You can cast it every turn you want. And this uses your charisma and targets enemy armor. So kind of like if you were using a ranged weapon with dexterity, this is kind of like your ranged attack, but you're using charisma, and you can upgrade this later to deal more damage based on your charisma. And this beam will get stronger over time as well, and you can make adjustments to it. But it gives you a reliable attack every turn instead of casting a spell. So you might think, well, Warlocks can only cast 2 spells in combat, so once they're out of 2 spells, they're kind of useless. That's just not the case. The Eldritch Blast is what makes them have very reliable damage every turn compared to like a Wizard or a Sorcerer, which once they run out of spells, they really aren't proficient at, combat with martial weapons, so they can't really do much. You pretty much got to go rest when you run out of spells with them, whereas with a Warlock, you can keep using Eldritch Blast and reliably deal damage, kind of like a martial class. Okay, so I know that was a lot to process. I hope you're still taking that all in. Let's move along to Sorcerer. And Sorcerers are spellcasters that have raw magic potential, right? They have magic flowing inside of them for whatever reason from their bloodline, or maybe an event happened to them where they gained their magic. So this is why they can cast their magic. And they also use the spellcasting ability modifier of Charisma. So just like Warlocks, they use Charisma to determine how successful their spells are going to be in combat. And again, just like Warlock, Charisma works very well in dialogue, so you can cast spells effectively while also improving your dialogue options. But in this case, you have Persuasion as well if you want to take Persuasion and be like a good character who convinces people to do things rather than forces them. So Sorcerer is a great option if you want to be a very dialogue-heavy character that does good things, but also is still very effective in combat. And the explanation of how Sorcerer works, thankfully, is a lot shorter than Warlock. So what's special about Sorcerers is that they gain this resource called Sorcery Points, which allows them to modify how their spells are used in combat through something called Metamagic. And as Sorcerers gain levels higher and higher, they'll gain more Metamagic features that allow them to change their spells in even more ways, and I'll give you a couple examples of what those are. One example is Metamagic Distance Spell, which increases the range of your spell by 50%, and if the spell has a range of 1.5 meters, then this is increased to 9 meters. So like a touch range spell will now actually have some range to it if you're going to use touch spells. And this costs you 1 sorcery point and then affects the spell of your choice. So maybe an enemy is just out of range and you need to get a little bit more range on your spell. Maybe you have a touch spell and you can't quite get to the enemy. This would be a great thing to use one of your sorcery points on to further boost your range. Another example is Metamagic Heightened Spell, which makes it so that the target, if they require a saving throw from the spell you're about to cast, has disadvantage on their first saving throw. So that means they're going to roll 2 dice and take the lower value of the 2, which means they're less likely to protect themselves against your spell. And now this costs 3 sorcery points, so it's a lot more expensive in terms of sorcery points, but it has a lot more potent effect, right? And another example is Metamagic Quicken Spell, which allows you to take the next spell or the spell that you effect with this as a bonus action instead of an action. And this costs 3 sorcery points as well because it's very effective. And what this would allow you to do is make a spell a bonus action, fling that spell, and then fling another spell with an action. And that's extremely powerful, allowing you to potentially throw 2 spells in one turn. And if you multi-classed your sorcerer with something like the Thief, you might actually have an extra bonus action. So maybe if you had enough sorcery points, which increase as your sorcerer levels up, you could actually fling 2 spells for bonus actions and 1 with your main action, which would be very, very deadly indeed. Now, you don't gain access to all these Metamagic class features instantly, and you'll have to choose the ones you want from a pool over time, so you'll have to look at what they do and decide what's the most valuable to you, and we'll give you tips about that in our Sorcerer Class Guide at launch, but that's just kind of the mechanic of them. And another thing to note is that you can actually exchange sorcery points for extra spells if you want to cast another spell and sacrifice some of your sorcery points, or you can sacrifice a spell to gain some sorcery points so you can boost another spell, and both of those things are a bonus action, so you can potentially do those in combat, then use some sorcery points, and then fling your spell. And then if you're talking a bit about the subclasses for this class and what they do, you have Wild Magic, Draconic Bloodline, and Storm Sorcery. And I'm not going to go into these in complete detail, we'll go to them more in our class guide, but essentially what these things do is if you choose Wild Magic, you basically have a chance for some crazy stuff to happen whenever you use a spell, a sorcerer spell. And it can be a good thing or a bad thing, and it's kind of random. So if you like random things happening in your game, you might choose that subclass. Draconic Bloodline makes it so that you gain your powers from a dragon, and it also gives you like damage resistance and extra damage effectively. That's a simplification with a specific damage type from the dragon that you pick. So maybe it's fire. You have a way of increasing your fire damage on your spells, and you also have a way of protecting yourself from fire damage as you get higher and higher in level. And you also gain increased armor class when you're not wearing armor. So if you want to be a bit tankier and not wear armor, then this is a good choice for you. Now keep in mind that you can always multi-class or pick up a race that gives you armor proficiency that might be better than doing this, but if you're planning on not using armor, then this is not a bad subclass to choose. And then Storm Sorcery has a focus on lightning damage, so if you want to play like a lightning specialist in terms of the sorcerer that you want to play, this is the subclass that you would choose. Okay, so moving on to Wizard. Wizards and Sorcerers have a lot more in common than Wizards and Warlocks do, and that's because at level 5, they can both cast the same amount of spells from the same levels. So when you think about it that way, there's a direct comparison there, and they're about the same in that regard. What makes them different, though, is that Wizards use Intelligence for their spellcasting modifier instead of Charisma, so they're not as good at dialogue, obviously, because they're not going to gain those extra points in dialogue scenarios, so you're not going to use a Wizard to be like a chatty Cathy with people generally. But Intelligence is also very good with skill checks and things like that. There are a lot of Intelligence checks in this game, so Wizards might lean a little more towards the skill side of things outside of dialogue to help you with things. And really what separates Wizards from Sorcerers, besides the fact that they don't have sorcery points, is that they have a spellbook. And they can learn spells and know tons of spells. They have the potential to know more spells than any class in the game. But what separates them really besides this is that they have to prepare the spells that they want to use. So you might have 50 spells that you know, but you can only prepare maybe like 8 at that point in time, and you have to choose what those are. So maybe you know the Fireball spell, but you go into combat and you forgot to prepare it. Maybe you have some other spells prepared instead. So you're looking for your Fireball and your spells, and you can't find it because you didn't prepare it ahead of time. So what you can do is you can either reload and go back and prepare that spell, or you can finish that combat and then prepare that spell afterward. And the way you prepare spells in Baldur's Gate 3 is simply by being outside of combat, going to your spell screen, and then preparing the spells just by clicking on the ones that you have prepared, removing one, and putting another one in if you want to change them around. And you'll frequently change these around in the game as a wizard. And the unique thing about the wizard is they have the sky's the limit for them and what they can do. They just need to know that they can do it or prepare to do it ahead of time. So there's some preparation that takes place. And I imagine Wizard will become more and more of a popular class as time goes on and people become more familiar with the game, probably in successive playthroughs where they know what's about to happen. They can equip the right spells. But when you're playing blindly, you never know what's going to happen, so you have to have a variety of spells prepared. Maybe you have some damage spells, some protection spells, some manipulation spells, etc., so that you have something ready for everything. And a lot of being a wizard is kind of setting yourself up for success depending on what you're about to do by preparing the right spells. And just like sorcerers, wizards have to long rest to gain their spell slots back. So after you've expended, your spells and you have no more spell slots, or maybe you've half them, but you're about to go into a tough fight, you want to have all of them, you need to go to your camp and rest just like Sorceress to gain these back. Warlocks don't need to do that. They can short rest, but again, they can only fling 2 spells at level 5, so they're going to have a lot less spells to throw than, Wizard or Sorcerer will. And at level 2, Wizards are going to gain something called Arcane Traditions, and what these are basically your subclasses, and you're going to focus or, prioritize in your studies, if you will, a specific type of magic, because Wizards gain their powers by studying at length these magic spells and becoming more and more proficient with them through study. So you're going to focus on one of 8 schools of magic, more or less. And we do know that the scrolls that you learn spells from cost less from the school that you're in, but they don't cost a fortune anyway. So if you go to learn a spell from one of the scrolls you find in this game that is a wizard class, because as of patch 9 of this game in early access, you can only learn wizard spells from scrolls. You can't learn them from other classes like cleric or druid, etc. But they didn't cost very much to learn to begin with, so cutting that in half is still there, but it's not like super important to this game. And what that means is that the class features of the school are going to be more important, in my opinion, than that. So you really want to take a look at what the class features are going to be. We don't know what these all are because we haven't seen most of these classes yet. But to give you one example of a class feature from the Evocation class. The Sculpt Spells feature makes it so that allied creatures automatically succeed in their saving throws and take no damage from spells that you cast. So if you throw like an AoE fireball into a group of enemies and your fighters in there and your barbarians in there, they don't take any damage from that. That's actually huge, and it's not such a huge thing early on in the game because you don't even have fireball early on in the game or a lot of AoE spells early on. But later in the game, that'll be really important, particularly when these spells start to hit harder and harder, and you don't want to hit your friendly units and you don't want to make decisions about where to position them. So you're really going to have to take a look at what these class features are for each class or subclass of wizard, and make your decisions based on that. With that said, though, even though we don't know how all the subclasses are going to be, we do know that, Wizard's going to play more or less the same, and that the effect of each school of magic might be a little less than it would be in 5e just because of some of the changes. And it's not going to be as big of a deal as it would have been on tabletop. So before we wrap things up in this video, let's talk a little bit about multi-classing and why you might multi-class some of these classes and what you might multi-class them with. I'll obviously go into these things in more detail in their class guides. Let's jump into this. People really like this from the previous video, so I want to talk a little bit about this. So talking a bit about Warlock and Sorcerer first, since they're both charisma-based, these two classes multi-class very well together because they're both charisma-focused, so charisma benefits both of their spell groups, and that's really, really good. A lot of people like to multi-class to pick up Eldritch Blast on their Sorcerer, or maybe pick up some of the Sorcery Points on their Warlock. So these things are a very good combination. There are also other good combinations like Bard multi-classes very well with these because it's charisma based as well. And you can even multi-class Paladin with either of these classes because it is also charisma based for its spell casting. So you can get a wide variety of combinations for these, but generally speaking, when you're multi-classing either Sorcerer or Warlock, you're probably going to be trying to multi-class it with another charisma focused class. And talking a little bit about Wizards, Wizards use intelligence for their spellcasting modifiers, so they don't necessarily mesh as well with Sorcerer or Warlock. A lot of people like to take Fighter on their Wizard, might sound counterintuitive, but they like to get the armor proficiencies from it to help make them tankier, and also some weapon proficiencies so they can actually use some weapons effectively in combat. And another thing that sort of synergizes here is the Eldritch Knight subclass of Fighter, which also gives you Wizard spells. So when you reach level 3, you're actually going to gain some spell slots, which will help catch you back up to where you would have been with your Wizard if you'd just taken Wizard all the way, although you'll be missing out on a few higher level spells. So there is some synergy with that as well. You could also multi-class with Rogue for similar reasons to gain, you gain spells with Arcane Trickster at level 3 that would help catch you back up and would give you, some proficiencies, particularly skill proficiencies, which synergizes nice if you want a very well-rounded skill wizard. And a lot of people like to multi-class their wizard with Cleric as well in order to pick up some spells from the Cleric spell list, even though Clerics use Wisdom for their spellcasting ability modifier. There are other things you can gain, like passives. For instance, if you take the War Domain subclass, you're going to gain bonus proficiency with martial weapons, which you had very little weapon proficiency before, and you're also going to gain heavy armor. So you could actually be a heavy armor wizard with no dexterity, being very, very tanky, and have weapons and still cast your spells just by taking a couple levels of Cleric. So that wraps up our video on Warlock, Wizard, and Sorcerer. I hope you guys found this useful. Again, this was not meant to be a full class guide on these classes, and I didn't talk a bit about every single detail that they get, as much detail as I did on Ranger and Rogue, because this video would have been another 15 minutes long. But I hope I gave you some idea how these spellcasting classes operate to help you further decide which one you would prefer to do in combat. Again, if you guys have feedback on the way these are going, if you have things you want to hear more about, such as multi-classing, or if there are combinations of classes you want compared, please leave them in the comments. This is helping me decide what to do next. We obviously have a lot of different combinations of classes you could do together because there are similarities between a lot of different combinations of classes. But the idea is that I'm trying to group classes that people might have narrowed down their choices to and help them decide between those 2 or 3 classes.